Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Susan Poisson-Locke and I'm an artist, writer and director of the Decolonising Arts Institute at the University of the Arts London, UAL. The UAL Decolonising Arts Institute has been in development since late 2018 and is currently in pilot phase. Conceived as a decentered, porous and evolving space, the Institute seeks to challenge colonial histories and imperial legacies, to recognise past and ongoing work, and to drive cultural, social and institutional change through practice and research, artistic, art historical, curatorial, museological and pedagogic. The past year has focused on setting up the Institute with a small core team and developing pilot projects and partnerships. We remain very much in formation. In summer 2019, we were awarded British Art Network funding to develop a seminar series under the rubric Decolonising British Art, Decentering, Resituating and Reviewing Artworks and Collections. Originally planned to take place as live events in May and June this year, we have evidently had to adapt for online in response to the pandemic. Moreover, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter has underscored the need for cultural institutions to address enduring structural inequalities and commit not just words, but actions to bring about change. Collections matter for the artists and artworks they remember or forget, and for the stories they tell or hide. And actions may not always be loud, large, and visible, but also slow, steady, and quiet. Developed in partnership with MIMA, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, Birmingham Museums Trust, Iniva, Institute of International Visual Art, and the Arts Council, British Council and Government Art Collections, the Decolonising British Art seminar series aims to explore recent and historical exhibition practices, curatorial strategies, and artistic interventions and provocations towards decentering, resituating, and reviewing artworks and collections. 3 seminars have taken place so far over the last 2 weeks. The first was with MIMA, which explored objects of attention, the question of how an object-centered approach can resituate artworks and collections, and the mutual subject-driven care and time needed to develop a collaboration between researchers and curators that was genuinely open and critical, illuminating institutional oversights and bringing about pragmatic changes to habits and approaches to curating, interpretation and display. The second seminar, with the Arts Council Collection, British Council Collection and Government Art Collection, discussed curatorial and artistic perspectives on how collections may attempt to centre or decenter particular narratives of art and artists, especially in relation to nation. What it means to care for artists as well as artworks and collections, and what are the privileges and relations, the discourses and mechanisms that permit value to be assigned or conversely withheld. And finally, what changes or not when an institution decides to bring or invite other voices in. Yesterday, the third seminar with Birmingham Museums Trust explored experimental approaches towards decolonising the museum through the lens and legacies of the 2017 exhibition, The Past is Now. And the discussion underlined the impossibility of neutrality for the museum, the need for transparency in terms of unequal relations of power and responsibility when engaging in collaboration, and a willingness to challenge and change these. Apologies for the interruption. The question of sustained care over time for artworks as well as artists came up yesterday, or rather how to ward against the structural and systemic neglect of people as well as objects to perhaps nurture and sustain the lives and practices of those on whom the futures of museums rely. So today we welcome you to the 4th and final seminar with Iniva, which I'll shortly hand over to Gaylene to introduce. Before I introduce Gaylene, allow me to share some links and access notes. In the top left-hand corner of your live stream window, the menu icon takes you to some organizational and artists links. And to the right of your live stream is a Q&A window. Please type any questions you have in this box here for the conversation segments of the seminar. And unfortunately, the closed captions function isn't available, but we do aim to add captions and BSL interpretation to the edited live stream recordings, and we'll let everyone know when these become available on the UAL YouTube channel. So now to introduce Gaylene, who may be familiar to you for many reasons. Gaylene is a creative director and consultant who designs interactive art spaces and projects. Her projects have been commissioned by and performed at the Tate, V&A, Arts Catalyst, Vivid Projects, Selfridges, H Club, Moderna Museet Sweden, and BAM New York. She's currently curating Brilliant Roots for Claw Leadership, a support space for Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse cultural leaders. Gaylene is also an arts broadcaster for the BBC, a published fiction writer, a cultural reviewer, and a cultural ambassador for London appointed by Mir Sadiq Khan. Over to you, Gaylene.
Thank you, Susan. And again, just thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a fascinating series of seminars, and I'm really looking forward to this one, the final seminar. So today we're going to be revisiting the 2003 touring exhibition Veil, which explored the symbolism of the veil in contemporary visual culture. Curated by Janan Al-Ani, David A. Bailey, Zineb Sedera, and Jalan Tawadros, and produced by Iniva in association with Modern Art Oxford. There was a related publication also called Veil, Veiling, Representation and Contemporary Art, which was edited by David A. Bailey and Gaylene. So today's seminar is going to be in 3 conversational parts. The first, we're going to invite Gaylene and Janan to introduce the project and share some reflections on curatorial and artistic strategies, critical responses, and the relevance of the exhibition today. In part 2, we invite the artists Maria Keika and Yara El-Shabini to share their reflections on Veil in relation to their own practices and strategies. And finally, we conclude the whole series with a conversation between Sipaki Anguiama, who is now the director of Iniva, and Susan Puisan-Locke, who will explore ideas of decentering, resituating, and reviewing in relation to visioning and revisioning institutes. So there's a lot. And what you also want to do is hear your voice in this as well. So I'm going to be pausing throughout that allow you to post your reflections, your questions. They really help in terms of making sure this is a dialogue between the contributors and yourselves. So I'll create some moments for you to do that. So let's start then with Jalan Tawadros, who's the Chief Executive of DAX, a not-for-profit visual arts rights management organisation, and co-director of the Art 360 Foundation, which she established in 2016. She is a curator and writer and was the founding director of Iniva. So Gaylene, over to you.
Thanks so much, Gaylene. And thank you to Susan Puisan-Locke, to Claire and her colleagues from the Decolonising Arts Institute at UAL, and Sipaki Anguiama and Iniva for inviting me to participate. I guess my job is, first of all, to set the scene a little bit around Veil, and tell you a bit about how the exhibition and publication came to be. So the exhibition was conceived by the artist Zineb Sedera, and it was researched and developed by Zineb with Janan Al-Ani over a period of about 4 years. So it emerged directly from the practice of visual artists. Zineb and Janan approached me when I was director of Iniva, and the final exhibition and accompanying publication was co-curated by Zineb, Janan, David and myself, as Gaylene set out. The curatorial team selected and commissioned new works for the exhibition, as well as texts for the publication. And there were 20 artists in all in the exhibition: Faisal Abdouallah, Kuro Shadim, AES Art Group, Janan Al-Ani, Ghada Amir, Farah Bajoul, Samta Ben Yahya, Gitanda Clarambourg, Marc Goranger, Sharafarine Gadirian, Gazelle, Emily Jassir, Ramesh Kalkur, Majida Katari, Shireen Nishhat, Harold Offey, Giulio Pontegoffo, Zainab Sedira, Ellen Strand, and Mitra Tabrizian. This was the first time in curatorial and exhibition practice that a project extended the possible interpretations of the veil and explored the ambiguities articulated in recent and contemporary practice, as opposed to presenting a polemical and academic thesis. I think that's really important and something I hope we'll come back to. It wasn't literal, it was playful, expansive in its understanding of what the veil was, and it brought together works that went against the grain of didactic and unambiguous representations. The exhibition came to fruition in 2003, but it had been conceived and developed before the events of September 11 and the attacks on the Twin Towers. I think it's difficult now, some 20 years later, to recall exactly how that event changed the discourse of everyday life in terms of introducing notions of Islamic terror, of suicide killing, of Arab dictatorship into everyday contemporary discourse. And in the aftermath of September 11, the veil became synonymous with cultural and religious differences that were often presented to us as alien, unbridgeable, and terrifying. The fact that the veil and veiling had been part of both Western and Eastern cultures for millennia, from the aristocratic women of ancient Greece to contemporary brides worldwide, hadn't diminished the overwhelming contemporary association with Islam and an abstract notion of the East. So, conceived before 9/11, the veil, however, collided with its political aftermath, and it attracted the attention of local authorities in Warsaw, which was the site of the first venue of the show, who censored artworks by the Russian art collective AES that were to be included in the show. The two works were digitally enhanced images from the group series The Witnesses of the Future Islamic Project. One featured New York's iconic Statue of Liberty veiled. The other depicted an Arab market on the bridge facing London's Houses of Parliament. And although these and other images from AES Islamic Project had been circulating on the internet for years, they were now deemed unpatriotic at a time when British and American forces were preparing to invade Iraq. So what you have is the sort of imagined geographies of the AES artists transgressing a political imaginary that had already decided the outcomes of a military invasion and territorial possession, and rejected what the writer Derek Gregory might call an uncompliant cartography. So here then you have a fictional geography colliding with a political reconfiguration of the geography of the Middle East post 9/11. And in this context, artistic interventions in the mapping of space and geography couldn't be separated from political and military intervention in the region. As I said, veil had been in development prior to the events of September 11, and it emerged out of the work and thinking of two artists, Janan Alani, who we'll hear from shortly, and Zainab Sedira. And both had been exploring the concept of the veil in their respective artistic practices. Zainab also talked about, she deployed the veil both as a visual motif, but also as a referent for what she called the less visible effects of veiling, what she described as veiling the mind. And again, I hope that's something we can come back to, because the exhibition worked hard to move away from fixed assumptions and unambiguous certainties. And importantly, the conviction that certain cultures are both knowable and representable in a literal sense. In the aftermath of 9/11, Vail inevitably became entangled in the struggle among competing polemical depictions of the Middle East that the project had sought to problematize and critique. And perhaps because of its very insistence on multiple ambiguous readings and interpretations, no venue in London or New York would even entertain the idea of showing the exhibition. Vail ultimately opened in 2003 in the New Art Gallery, Walsall, and the two AES works removed from the show turned up on the front pages of the local newspaper in full colour. Vail became a talking point in Walsall pubs and cafes and attracted 35,000 visitors over the course of its 2.5-month run. Many people looking back saw Vail as being in some way prescient or prophetic of future events and debates about political Islam, religious difference, and the veil and veiling in public and political discourse. But I think what's really important, and what I would argue, is that the very process of researching, creating artworks for, and curating the exhibition constituted a means of reading the world through the prism of the visual. And because it did that, the conceptual framework of Vail as an exhibition and publication was one that amplified paradoxes and ambiguities, precisely because it emerged from the preoccupations of two artists whose practice resolutely avoids fixity and closure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaylene. There's lots to dig into there for sure. And we'll have a chance after Janan's presentation. So do get either put your questions in now or do get them ready. So now over to the artist in question. Janan Al-Ani is an artist, researcher and lecturer working with photography, film and video. So we're going to go to Janan now. Thank you very much. And we'll go to your presentation.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Gaylene, for that fantastic summary of the development of the exhibition. That's really going to help me now, because one of the things I've really struggled with is how to, well, firstly, looking back at a show that was conceived more than 20 years ago and to now kind of reconsider it, which is actually really challenging. So I think I'm going to start, in fact, with the same image that you started with, Gaylene. And just try to say a bit about the scale, the scale of it. So Ghislaine's already explained that it was in 1998 that Zineb and I started talking about the possibility of making an exhibition, and that had come out of conversations we'd been having with each other about our own practice and how differently we'd approached the idea of the veil, or the image of the veil, or the veil as an object or as an idea. But you know, the fact that we began, and it's very interesting that 98 is actually 200 years to the year after Napoleon invades Egypt, which you refer to in the introduction to the catalogue, Gaylene, that we start having this conversation. And of course, in the 5 years between the earliest discussions and the show actually materializing, right in the middle of that, the attacks of September the 11th happen. And the exhibition opens on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War. So, as Ghislaine's already said, this is really, these are very tumultuous events that have a huge impact on all of our lives in a way. And for artists particularly who are working with the idea of representation in this very highly politicized context, it did shift our thinking about the exhibition in some ways. So we'd started talking in 98, and my interest in the veil had come really through looking at Western Orientalist painting. So quite a different starting point to Zineb's, which Gaylene has already mapped out a little bit. And as somebody who'd grown up in the Middle East in Iraq and then moved to Britain as a teenager and experienced the 91 Gulf War from this side, I was really shocked at how the conflict revealed that the 19th century Orientalist idea of the Middle East was really very sort of embedded in Western thinking. And I started to look at the relationship between the painting tradition and the photographic tradition in Western art, particularly in relation to the representation of women and Oriental women. So this is a Angkor painting, and I started getting very interested in the kind of photographs that were being made by Western photographers who were traveling to the Middle East and kind of recreating these Orientalist fantasies in the studio. And one of the features, I think, of the works that really stands out in the exhibition is that so many of the artists that we were interested in, that we included in the show, are working with lens-based media, either photography or film, some element of performance as well, and theatre. And this was very, I think this is a significant thread in a lot of the work. This relationship between the photography and the real is something that's very significant. The fact that it appears as an objective, clinical, scientific way of looking at the world, and also the way in which it was adopted by anthropology and anthropology and archaeology as this means of disseminating information. So where Zineb was interested much more, for example, she talks in her essay in the catalogue about this idea of the veiling of the mind and censorship, the idea of censorship and self-censorship. And what we'd started to do was pick out and notice other artists who are working in the contemporary art field and touching on not the same issues, but approaching the veil from different perspectives. So some of the artists that we were starting to notice were, for example, Shirin Neshat. So this was in the late 90s when the Women of Allah series that Shirin Neshat made started to be seen in American exhibitions. That hadn't been shown in England at that point, that work in Britain. We were interested in artists like Ghada Amr, Mitra Tabrizian, Shadi Ghadirian, so young artists as well, emerging from the Middle East, who were working with the image of the veil and photography. And one of the artists that we were very excited about was Emily Jasser, whose work that we saw in a show that we were both in Copenhagen at the Nicolai Gallery. And one of the things that's very important about this work from Paris to Riyadh was the way in which it sort of interrogates the control of women's bodies, both in a sense from a Western perspective and an Eastern perspective. And I think that's what a lot of the artworks in the show do. They're not coming from a singular perspective, and they're engaged in a kind of dialogue. So this work is work that she made where she, based on her childhood experience of traveling between Paris and Saudi Arabia with her mother, who was taking copies of Vogue magazine with her. And in order to get them through the censors in Saudi Arabia, her mother would have to use a black felt pen and cover all the bare flesh on the models' bodies in the magazine. And so she went back and found these 1970s editions of Vogue and colored in herself each page using tracing paper, the flesh on the bodies. And she carries on doing that through a number of years. And what's very interesting is the way in which the amount of black that appears on the page increases as time goes on. So she's making a comparison between the way in which women's bodies in the West are needing to be seen and revealed and exposed, and women's bodies in the East being covered somehow. So it's two sides of the same coin in terms of representation of women's bodies and the control of women's bodies. And that works related very strongly for us to these historic works. There were three key works in the show that were what we consider to be kind of historic framing works. One was these portraits by Marc Garanger, the French photographer, of Algerian women that he'd photographed in 1960 when he was serving in the Algerian military, where he was forced to make women take their veils off so he could photograph them for their identity cards. And he talks very beautifully about his shame at having to be a tool really of French imperialism and forcing these women to do this, and how he tries to kind of much later on, tries to kind of apologize in a sense for these actions. But these portraits are really extraordinary. So there are, I think we included, I can't remember, Gaylene might know, maybe 20 from this series in the exhibition. These really extraordinary photographs in which the women appear to be resisting just in their gaze back at him in at the camera. The other work we included was the film by Pontecorvo, The Battle of Algiers. So Algeria occupied a very important position in the exhibition because of having been a French colony for 100 years, and how the battle over the veil had raged in Algeria, and of course continues to rage today in France. This is not a new fight over the veil in France. It specifically relates back to this history with Algeria and the veil being associated with backwardness and the need for its removal to be a sign of sort of civilization and development. And of course, in the resistance against French occupation, in the film, it's represented the way in which the resistance fighters use the veil as a kind of act of resistance to cover themselves so they can actually infiltrate French forces. And you know, so the veil takes on a very different reading in this context. I think, have I done my 10 minutes now? I was just going to show a couple of images from, I was going to show the images, just touch very, very briefly on the controversy with the censoring of the images in the Warsaw exhibition. This is unfortunately a black and white scan of the original newspaper. So one of the local newspapers supported the gallery and supported the artists in reproducing the images that had been censored. But in a sense, this was kind of, this headline in another local paper was a sign of more to come, really, and maybe we can talk about that later. You know, the way in which all our efforts to make the debate around the veil and the image of the veil through contemporary artist practice complex and nuanced and rich had somehow it felt somehow at that point that all that work had been undone, that these artworks being described as September the 11th art was just, you know, beyond, yeah. So I think I should stop there.
Thank you so much, Janan. A fascinating case study and quite different to what we've been hearing on in the other seminars. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation around them. What I'm going to do is give the audience and ourselves actually time to think of any reflections or questions to both of those presentations, just for a minute or two before we come back. So for you in the audience, you need to fill out the little question bit on the screen. It's very clear where it is, and then we can weave those questions into the Q&A. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to do that. We'll come back 2 minutes. There you go. Hello, thank you for that. I'm going to start with a question, which, as the questions come in from the audience, there's something that Susan says in the introduction to this seminar where she speaks about change often being long and slow. And I was thinking about the timeline that you gave us from 200 years since Napoleon invaded Egypt, the fact that 1998 was the time you began thinking about this, and then it lands at this moment, it collides with this major geopolitical event, and suddenly the meaning radically shifts. So I'd love for you to speak a bit more about, as artists, as curators, you know, your reflections on that, I guess.
Well, personally, for me, 1991 is a really significant date, not just because of the Iraq War, but because that's the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And actually, that's the moment of the end of the Cold War, is the time when this new phenomenon of the Islamic radicalized Islam and this movement that's coming out of the Middle East starts to appear as a kind of threat to the West. It becomes a new threat. You know, there always has to be an enemy, and this was very clear from the beginning. This was where we were kind of heading, and that's one of the reasons why the AES works are so interesting, because these are artists who are operating now in a collapsing Soviet Union, and they're making works. These works were made in 1996, so very shortly after that. And they're already picking up also on this new narrative and creating this kind of fictionalized. The images actually come from an estate, a travel agency that they established. They kind of set themselves up as travel agents, and they would open shops in various cities around Europe, so maybe in Berlin or in Madrid, and they would put all these posters up of all these Islamicized European cities or Western cities. So they were kind of like a travel agency for the future post this kind of nightmare of fundamentalist Islam taking over the entire world. So one of the things that they talk about when their work gets censored in the Warsaw show is this kind of nostalgia for this kind of state control and censorship, which I just thought was so fantastic, especially for me coming from a country like Iraq where state censorship was so overt. I could really
yes,
extraordinary.
It connects in multiple ways, isn't it? Gaylene, what about your thoughts now, I guess, in hindsight, years beyond this moment? What's your reflections on that as a...
I was thinking about this, and I was thinking how, as Janan was saying, the dismantling of the colonial frame is a long and slow process. And something like 5 years after the Veil show opened in Warsaw, we had the exhibition The Lure of the East at the Tate. And I was in and out of the Tate quite a lot during that time. And what really shocked me was that the curator of that show one day stopped me and said, my inspiration for this exhibition, he said, and he dug into his satchel and he pulled out Lane's The Egyptians, which is one of the works that Edward Said talks about as a kind of quintessential Orientalist text that looks at the Middle East through this colonial prism. And I think that's what's really important to think about, is the loops that we're in, and how there isn't this kind of these ruptures that we like to think of the world in terms of epochs and major shifts, but the reality is it's never that clean. It's never that clean cut. And some years after the Veil show, I was doing some research around actually regimes of torture, and I discovered that Gilo Pontekova's film was being showed to CIA agents as training to go out to Iraq. And in fact, French military who had been in Algeria also were being used to train US agents. And that this film, this piece of fiction, which Pontekova's film is, it's a work of fiction, but made to look like a documentary, then enters into, realpolitik as a version of truth and instruction. So similarly, Lane's Egyptians purports to be this instructional manual about how to understand these wily Orientals. Of course, it's nothing of the kind. It's a piece of colonial literature. So I think, that constant, that sense of the loops of history and representation are really, really important.
Yes. I think I just think there's something very interesting. We've been talking a lot about museum collections which are collecting real objects, but also artistic works. We've been speaking a lot about the relationship between the real and the imagined and how they collide in these spaces. I just want to come to a couple of the questions from the audience. There's a question about a couple of people about talk about the Blue Coat show. So Pauline D'Souza wants to know how it was received, and Brian Biggs is saying he thinks the AAS work was included in the show in Liverpool. Is that the case?
Yeah. Yes, it was. There was a very sorry, go on, Jenna.
No, and in Oxford, they were actually commissioned to make an Oxford poster. You know, they showed, you know, the spires of Oxford, you know, made into a kind of bazaar. It's a little bit like the London House of Parliament work. So they made a special, we did a special commission with them for that. So
what changed? What changed between the works not being allowed to be showed in the Warsaw show and then later on?
The conditions in Warsaw were very specific. You know, basically we were sort of told, it was a pronouncement, that the council would not allow us to open the exhibition unless the AAS works were removed. And we really struggled to draw an explanation from the council as to why. We thought it was because there'd been some recent elections down the road where there'd been a kind of escalation in far right wing politics in Burnley, I think it was, wasn't it? And so we had made this assumption about the reasons for the censorship being that the council was sort of worried about the exhibition being seen to be provocative and therefore exacerbate, you know, these political formations that were starting to emerge. But actually it wasn't that at all. It turned out that one of the invigilators, or one of the members of staff who worked for the gallery, had a brother who was in the army, I think, and was, you know, being posted to Iraq, and thought that these works were unpatriotic and had therefore put pressure on Walsall Council to remove the works. And we had a long debate, didn't we, Anne, about whether we should go ahead or not, and how we should deal with this censorship.
Yeah. I mean, we made the works present in the sense that we kept the spaces where the work was going to be shown in the gallery. We made and the AAS works were going to be absolutely monumental prints. They were going to be enormous. So we marked out the space where the prints would have been on the wall, and we put a sign up. The gallery put their own little sign up. So we kind of had a bit of a tussle because the gallery were under huge pressure from the council who were funding them, basically. And they were kind of claiming that there would be, you know, a danger to public safety because these images would somehow invoke a riot or something.
But what was brilliant was the newspaper. And in fact, and I'm so glad you had that. I was looking for that and I couldn't find it. But not only that, but this entrepreneurial newspaper seller set up in front of the gallery to sell that evening's edition. And actually the very act of censorship had completely the opposite impact.
Right.
Because it made it,
But also we all wore the images on. We had T-shirts printed. So everybody who went to the opening, and that was the opening where we invited as many of the artists as we could to come and join us. We all wore these T-shirts with both images, one on the front and one on the back. So we had the word censored across the top, and you know, so we kind of did a sort of impromptu protest in the space. But just in terms of the kind of general press, what was very interesting is that, you know, there was a lot of interest in the exhibition, and we were invited, Ghazal, one of the artists in the show, and I were invited to talk on Women's Hour about the exhibition, and I was slightly miffed that we weren't on front row, but we were on Women's Hour. And, you know, the person who was interviewing us, I can't remember who it was now, wanted to talk about the veil only in the context of the Muslim veil and only in the context of the Middle East and the Middle East politics. And all through, because these are pre-recorded interviews, all through I kept talking about other artists' work and saying, well, and Harold Ofer did these amazing performances, and so, and you know, and Aline Strand, who's Swedish, you know, did this incredible installation where she had people performing and they were all wearing this huge dress that they were all sewing and sewing machines at the same time as wearing it, and all of that was cut. So the only bits that remained in the interview related to Middle Eastern artists. And then Gaylene, of course, was invited onto front row to talk about the censorship. So, you know, we got our front row slot, but it was all focused on the censorship and not on the artwork.
And in fact, it was pitched to front row initially to the arts editor, Frances, her name now, who does a lot of film reviews. And she was adamant that she didn't want this project discussed on front row. So, you know, there's a whole sort of story, another account.
So also even commercial galleries didn't necessarily want their artists to be seen in this context, simply because we'd titled the work Veil in the end, which was a kind of, in a way, a post 9/11 decision, I think, to give it that title. We had hours of conversations about the title of the show.
What might it have been? What
oh
was,
God,
do you remember?
No, it's too far
not.
back. But in the end, it had to be something kind of confrontational and demanding attention, because we just felt, you know, we'd sort of moved from this position where the veil, in Western terms at least, had either been seen as a kind of sexualized, you know, within the Orientalist fantasy, or it was a kind of image for the oppression of downtrodden Muslim women. You know, it didn't really have anything other than those two archetypes. And then suddenly out of this emerged this third one, which now dominates, which is this, you know, politicized, violent, you know, the first women who appear in the press as suicide bombers are veiled. The women in the Moscow siege are veiled. You know, they suddenly become a threat and a symbol for something completely different. So
we should also pay tribute, you know, to Walsall Art Gallery, to Bluecoat Art Centre, Brian Biggs, and Andrew Nairn at Modern Art Oxford, because really, I mean, the stonewalling that this exhibition received was quite phenomenal. Quite phenomenal.
Yeah, having said that though, Gaylene, when I did a talk about the censoring of the exhibition at the showroom, Chantal Mouffe was on the panel, and she was really excited and couldn't believe how this show hadn't had a venue in France to be, you know, toured in France. But we didn't manage to get very far, did we?
No.
In Europe, apart from Sweden.
Sweden, Kulturhuset. Sweden.
I mean, I think there is a question from the audience which I think connects to this, and then I think I'd love to talk about your wider thoughts on it. But the question is, do you think the exhibition would have been received differently had it opened before 9/11, and if so, how? And obviously the answer to that is yes. But if it had, have you got any idea of what difference that might have made in the reception? Do you think it would have gotten picked up more? Do you think it would have been
very hard to answer. Hard to answer that question. I mean, I think that, I think it was just, I think it was really ahead of its time, precisely because Janan and Zina were thinking through questions that Janan has articulated so eloquently through practice, through visual arts practice, you know, not through a kind of setting out a polemical or academic thesis about the veil and veiling. And and therefore, in a way, it was, I don't want to sound sort of magic alchemy or anything, but I think it articulated complex and nuanced questions that, had you attempted to articulate those through an academic discourse or through a sort of another mode, if you like, I think would have been quite difficult and would have closed things down, rather than what it ended up being, which was an incredibly nuanced and open. And one of the things we haven't said about, which was the audience profile. Walsall had never seen an audience that was so mixed in its history until the Veil exhibition opened. And that was really, really explicit, and goes to show again that, you know, if you change the content of what you show, it radically transforms the audiences.
Yes. Harold Offey is on the line in the audience. No, wait to Harold. And he's interested in that, in terms of the fact that it toured, you know, it was Warsaw, Liverpool, Oxford. So it wasn't London, it wasn't New York City, it was outside these metropolitan centres. And I wonder if that affected who came, who saw it, that kind of audience mix. You know, was there a kind of a specific audience that you got because it was in those cities, rather than the kind of metropolitan kind of audience and conversation?
Actually, you know what? It'd be great if Harold could tell us about his experience, because Harold made a version of his work in Oxford, and I think didn't you also do it in, was it, I can't remember now, Harold, was it Liverpool or Warsaw? But you know, his experience of doing his performance in a public space, I think, would have been very different depending on where he was. Are you there, Harold?
Harold, if you can type
Sorry,
type fast.
to put you on the spot.
That's why I showed.
That'd be great for him.
I showed those last two stills from Harold's film because actually, in a way, for me, they absolutely articulate that confrontation, which, how do you navigate difference?
Gaylene, I think your internet is a little bit shaky. It's a little bit unstable. But I heard you, so I'm hoping everybody else did there. But I think I'm very interested in this. We've been hearing a lot, some wonderful curators working across museums, and I'm interested in, like you were saying, the difference between this being an artist-led exhibition, even if we're talking about institutions. I suppose what it said about Iniva at the time, in terms of what Iniva as an institution, was there a difference in how Iniva wanted to work in terms of positioning work within the cultural landscape? And if so, what might that have been?
Well, I think the first thing is that I think Iniva, we wanted Iniva to be a permeable organisation. And, you know, it had originally been conceived as being a sort of white cube space, but evolved for a number of reasons into being a project that took place in multiple spaces and had lots of partnerships with artists, curators, intellectuals, but didn't kind of exist in terms of a fixed space, a fixed hierarchy, a curatorial hierarchy, and so on. And I think that meant that Iniva could be responsive to artists and intellectuals who were thinking through questions about Britishness, about identity, about contemporary culture, and create spaces or negotiate spaces for the articulation of those ideas and those artworks. I think that's what was important. And that was a rich, rich scene.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, go ahead, Janelle.
In relation to institutions, I had to say that as artists who sort of started off with this fantasy idea of building this exhibition, you know, we couldn't have done it without the institutions that supported us. And we started conversations with David Bailey and Mark Seeley. And in fact, Autograph supported us in doing an application to get some kind of research and development money from the Arts Council initially to develop the project. And, you know, we had a national call out, and we were looking for artists, and when Iniva finally decided that they would support the project fully, and Gaylene would come in on the curatorial side as well, and David would be, you know, we would form this curatorial team. You know, all of the kind of infrastructure that Iniva could offer in terms of supporting it was extraordinary. I mean, it wouldn't have happened without that institutional support. You know, we applied for national touring funding, you know, the publication, which for me is so important because it's not a catalogue. This is a publication in which all of these issues are discussed and debated, and we commissioned new writing, and we republished historic texts, and we put lots more imagery in than was in the exhibition. You know, all of those things wouldn't have happened without the institutional support of Iniva. And for me, one of the most important things about Iniva at the time was that it didn't have a space. It was really important it didn't have a space, because in a sense its job was lobbying other public arts institutions to look at this work and show it. You know, it was this whole kind of arm twisting. I mean, other organizations do that. Film and Video Umbrella operate like that. But, you know, this we had a different agenda, you know, and it was to try and show works that other people were not showing in a really serious and considered way.
Talking about, the great thing is we have Gaylene here, we have Sapake next, and we also have Melanie Keane, who was the Iniva director afterwards. And I'm going to hand the last question over to Melanie, who's saying, so did you imagine that the ideas contained in Veil would resonate so intensely today? So if it was to be stated, what do you think the impact would be?
Very hard to answer that question. But I think that I hadn't imagined actually that questions around Islam, around veiling, around difference would remain so antagonistic. So if anything, you know, this question of negotiating difference, the impossibility or possibility of it, has become even more acute now than it was then. In the sense, we were at the beginning of something, and I wouldn't have imagined that at that point. I don't know what Janan feels.
No, I agree, and I think everything that's happened in the Middle East since, you know, all the shocking things that have followed in the Middle East have had an impact too. And I think, you know, the rise of the right, and if we think about Trump and the Muslim ban and all of this vitriol that's followed has been kind of extraordinary. But one of the things that really heartens me is that in the last 5 years, I've had young researchers approach me to ask questions about this exhibition, you know, students who are writing about it, who are thinking about it, who are reconsidering it. So although for me it feels like it's very far in the past now in terms of certainly my own practice and preoccupations, I'm really, you know, the fact that Susan wanted to organise this seminar around the exhibition, you know, that clearly there is still an interest and it's still an important, it still may be raising questions. I mean, I can't make that claim for it, but the fact that people are showing an interest in it says something, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating experience to kind of walk through. As I need you to stage it again so I can actually be there and see it. And
it was a beautiful exhibition. It was such a beautiful exhibition.
For sure. Well, I appreciate both of you for bringing the memory of it back here with us today. So Gaylene, Janan, thank you very much. Audience, we're going to go to break now. Welcome back, everybody. So for the second part of the seminar, we're now going to hear from two artists, Maria Keika and Yara El-Shabini, who are going to share their reflections on Veil in relationship to their own practices and strategies. So first to Maria. Maria Keika is a British Iranian artist whose multidisciplinary art practice is generated by the interplay of history, politics and media through curating, installation, film, photography and performance. Maria will touch on an earlier exhibition of Shireen Nishat's work at the Serpentine in relation to the exhibition Veil, as well as her own practice. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thanks, Gaylene, for that introduction. And I'd like to extend my thanks to UAL Decolonising Art Institute and Iniva for inviting me, and all the people who've been working behind the scene. So I think I'm just going to start with my presentation here. Okay, I thought I'll show you some of my work, which spans film, photography, and performance. And I'm just going to move to second slide. In recent years, I've also done some curated as well. In both artistic and curatorial works, my aim is to question and problematize expectation, assumptions, and categorization while engaging with global issues in relation to my current social and political context. I'm going to go to the third one. Here are, in reflecting back on the Veil exhibition in 2003 and the Veil as a subject, I think it would be difficult for me not to acknowledge Shireen Nishat's exhibition in 2000, at the Serpentine Gallery, which I believe was pivotal and highly significant to many women artists of my generation, and certainly in relation to the discourse of the subject of women wail and wailing. It was, to my knowledge, the first time in the UK that we see a woman artist of the Muslim diaspora occupy a major art gallery in London dedicated entirely to the subject of woman, wail, and Islam. Soon after Nishat's exhibition, I remember numerous discussions with Zinab Sidira and other artist friends about Nishat's work and her exhibition in 2000. For me, perhaps the most significant element of the Wail exhibition are the collections of essays and the catalogues, in particular Leila Ahmad's essay on the discourse of the Wail, Frantz Fanon's pivotal essay, For Me, Algeria Unveiled in 1965, which highlights the significance of the Wail and unveiling, both in relation to the native Algerian and the French colonialists, particularly with regard to the important role of Algerian women during the struggle in Algerian society. I also note Alison Donald's significant essay, Visibility, Voice, Violence and Voice, Attitudes to Wailing Post 11th of September. I shall return to this. My thoughts regarding the Wail exhibition and catalogue was that many of the images in the publication focused mainly on colonial and Orientalist images of the Wail by depicting it being worn rather than engaging with contemporary practices of wailing in relation to class, status, and the breadth of wailing practices transnationally. As Hudal Lutfi, in her review of the catalogue and the images of artists' work, remind us, wailing is not limited to Muslim women and their bodies meant to practice wailing and continue to do so in various countries. She suggests that this might have extended and expanded our view of the wail. This brings me to the next slide, and that's the that developed after two previously mentioned, so that the Wail and Shirin Neshat's exhibition, and the issue of, in my view, the overuse of the Wail as a signifier. I would argue that such images and the emphasis upon the Wail could only create further reiteration of Oriental and colonial narratives that distort and continue to focus upon issues of subjugation, ideas of modernity versus tradition, lack of agency and freedom, and so on. Historical and political events, so if you think about 9/11, which served to generate greater negative stereotypes. Continued centralization and emphasis of the Wail as a signifier to the image of the woman in any context, whether gallery or newspaper, indicate that the idea of undifferentiated uniformity continues to be achieved through repetition, words, image, and rhetoric. The title and images here as front cover of catalogues, books, and magazines often playfully and powerfully tap into the curiosity of the public towards countries with a colonial history. Imagery around the Wail almost always seems to draw upon this other geographical space that are not here, where there is a significant history. These well-established images and spaces have a relationship both exoticized and troubled, which add to established colonial trope of being in need of both rescue and pity, which makes these images both desirable, threatening, and familiar. Alison Donald's writing in the Wail exhibition catalogue suggests that because of a Western preoccupation or determined concentration on wailing, the Wail, both in its textual form as a book title, as well as in its visual form, images of wailed women, and I would further add exhibitions and exhibition titles to that, provides a ready-made or cliched platform for the creative and literary industry. Donald illustrates this position by discussing a show from the Oprah Winfrey Show that was broadcast on 5th of October 2001. According to Donald, drawing on Adina Niazi's account of the program, Winfrey initially invited the Agency Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, to discuss their work in relation to Afghan women and Islam. However, many of RAWA's concerns went unheard as the focus quickly shifted into a discussion of the hijab as a highly charged symbol of difference that paralyzes productive cross-cultural debate. To return to artistic output, the question arises as to whether artists, writers, and cultural producers can avoid a reductive identity politics that continue to speak to the public significantly through the narrow spectrum of images of the whale. This is not to undermine the importance of the whale and a valid subject or as a valid subject or image for women artists, but it is a criticism of its preeminent centralization and symbolic connection to negative identity politics, self-orientalization, and self-othering. To be clear, I have used this signifier in my own work, and I'm going to show you some of the work that I was doing at the time when the Iniva show, or kind of when Iniva show was in preparation, I think. This In Love with the Red Wall, which is a photographic triptych made in 2003, where I imagine a situation between a particular person and the wall, which raises multi-layered group of issues such as complexity of language, perception, illusions, desires, and endurance. Simultaneously, this is a symbol for the problem of unresponsive and monolithic stereotyping, expectation, and cultural misunderstanding. 5 minutes video piece where I use my own hair as a veil, using a soundtrack associated with belly dancing, restricting the shot to a close-up rather than the focus on the body as a way to denying the exoticizing gaze, creating an identity and connecting it at the same time. This work, this triptych, is titled Little Egypt. I follow the historical account of Kochak Khanum, 19th century Ghawazi dancer during Gustav Flaubert's travel and to Egypt in 1849, and how these accounts came to shape Orientalist ideas of women of the East. I then follow the transformation of her name over time, which reappears in 1965's Hollywood movie Roustabout. I think is now I'd like to prompt you with the video. I'm just wondering if Clara could show the video now.
After the attacks on the New York World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, I noticed a significant drop in the projects I was being given as a freelance artist, teaching and working on various artistic projects at the Picture Gallery in Gaylene Village, close to where I lived for many years, married to a Welshman, and where I brought up our son. The oldest public art gallery in Britain, the Picture Gallery, houses classical English and European paintings in the permanent collection within its classical European art. Here there was never any mention of my kind of art, by which I mean contemporary art outside of Europe, outside of a Eurocentric region, leaving the void where I could insert my existence, where I could become visible. Here in this place I felt as all that was female and that was alien. Simultaneous to to my lots of artistic projects, I noticed a change of attitude at work and even in my domestic space.
This is where I felt
even the mothers with whom I used to talk at the school that my son attended in Dulwich started to cross-examine me about the 9/11 attacks. Suddenly I was a subject, an object of discussion. Suddenly I became representative of the Muslim world. I became guilty of nothing, yet the subject of a hostile gaze. All sorts of questions were fired at me, as though I had some kind of inside knowledge of the attacks. Overnight I became the Muslim ambassador Keika, guilty of nothing, yet under surveillance by anybody who fancied letting their frustrations, let alone into personal and professional scores, to show me my place. It was in this climate that I began to feel my difference most acutely as conducted. This is where I felt the perception of me, in fact my image, shifted from Oriental to Islam Oriental most severely. I was now part of the axis of evil. In most social interactions, when I'm not known or as I go about my business in public, I usually pose as an arbitrator. If my appearance was commented on and as soon as my accent was questioned, my origin became apparent, the attitude would change. The smile would give away to a more sober look and I would be
in the heart of Dulwich village. I placed my camera on a tripod on the pavement on the other side of the road and shot my body in full length.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I conclude my talk.
Thank you so much, Maria. So now we're going to hand over to Yara El-Shabini, whose multidisciplinary practice encompasses live art, video and installation. Yara will also reflect on the Veil exhibition in terms of its influence on her artistic practice in the same period and her use of humour and playful use of language to explore religion, identity and representation.
Hello, thank you so much again to everybody for including me on this panel. It's been absolutely fascinating. And actually, I'm going to come from this from a very, very different and very personal, incredibly personal perspective, because I thought what would be most useful was also to talk about the significance of the Veil exhibition to a young artist of the time. So just very briefly, just again to talk about the context, and the context also sort of the period in which this exhibition was being developed for me, and how the modes of presentation in the exhibition and the diverse perspectives really influence the way I make work and think about making work. So again, talking about this from a very different angle from the fantastic conversations so far. So as someone growing up with dual mixed identities as an Egyptian British artist, growing up, I didn't even understand or engage with contemporary conceptual art until I went to Art Foundation and discovered the work of Mona Hatoum, which completely opened my eyes to the ways in which artists were grappling and talking about deeply political and social issues. I'd grown up moving between Saudi and England constantly. So it was really interesting that the work of Emily Jassir for me was so very particular and so relatable in terms of my own everyday experience when we would get off the plane and our magazines were all so censored by the staff in the airport. But also after my foundation, I moved to Egypt, and it was only there that I discovered art by Egyptian artist Ghada Amir. I saw her work in museums and exhibitions and gallery spaces in Cairo, and I was starting to learn about art outside of a Western canon. I had not known about these kinds of works, about these kinds of artists. Again, I grew up in a small town in the north. I wasn't exposed to everything. And we also have to remember that the internet in the late 1990s was not what it was now. We'd have to book a session. So for me to learn about other contemporary Arab artists making work was absolutely significant and radical. So I can see a message. I just need to see if it's about this from Tom. I'm going to start sharing my screen shortly, but I wanted to start also really by talking about it, and then I'm going to bring in some images, just a couple of images in a minute. So for me, that idea of coming back to the UK, starting my university in 1999 and 2000, there were no books about artists from the Arab world. There were 2 books in my library in Bristol, 2, with works by Zineb Sedira and Jeannin. They were the only 2 books that I would go over and over again. I would read every essay, cross-reference. Again, this was a time of very limited half-an-hour slots of the internet. I had to research on my own. But what they showed me were different ways of looking at the own issues I was dealing with and grappling with in terms of identity, years of living with the veil on myself just because of being in Saudi, not out of choice, living in Egypt and exploring the dichotomy and the issues I was grappling and how I could find art that represented that. And actually in the late 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't anything. For me, one of the most significant exhibitions in my life has been Sensations, which opened up ways of seeing. And I was in desperate need for exhibitions that showed issues around the veil and identity and questions I was asking. So for me, when I found out this exhibition was on, it did actually radically change my way of seeing. It was an exhibition. I didn't go to lots of exhibitions. I didn't have money, but I made sure I went to Oxford. I went to see the show, and it was a personally very significant experience. And why I'm saying this is that sometimes when the curators put on these shows and, lots of people see it, you don't really see the personal way in which it changes an artist's life and an artist's perspective. And I think I wanted to share that today. So again, Islamophobia, of course, was a very, very, very real thing for me to experience in 2001 in university in Bristol. And then to be able to know that and I was constantly making work about the veil and about identity, and then to see this collection of this exhibition with all this work was amazing. I got to see Ghada Amir's work, Emily Jassir's work that again I absolutely related to, and what I loved was Harold Offey's work. So what showed me was this breadth and depth of ways of making work and how artists can agitate and create dialogue and create conversation. And my entire practice is always about ways in which to find different ways to make work. And I think what was really fascinating is the breadth and depth of kinds of work. And though it was lens-based, we still had Harold going out in the streets and making works that were participatory or, in a sense, live, and it was video represented in a different way. So I think for me, it was about how it became a seminal exhibition to think about ways of unpicking representations. So I think the reality also, and I'm going to share my screen now, is also about the way in which, sorry, one moment, artists are constantly moving in and out of notions around representation. We're constantly thinking about how we want to either be represented. Do we want to sit within one of these boxes that all curators need to frame exhibitions? Do we want to sit outside of them? And for me, I think one of the things is the Veil exhibition pushed me also to question, yes, making work from my own perspective, but also wanting to sit outside of that and have work that is seen for the quality of the work and not being read within a context of identity. So for me, that began a very personal journey in 2003 when I went to see this show. So again, I'm just going to talk about 2 things around the time of 2003. So in 2005, Bookworks approached me, a guest editor, Sarah Wejid, who was incredibly amazing, invited me to create a book, quote unquote, on the Muslim vernacular. And for me, I had an issue that they were asking me, even though I didn't have a history of that time of particularly making work about Islam, to specifically make a work about the Muslim vernacular because I happen to be a Muslim artist, and having that very personal battle with whether I wanted to be framed within that or whether I wanted to be invited by Bookworks just to make a book. Again, the reality is we need to think about the opportunities that are given to us and that constant interplay between how we can look at institutions and work with them and organizations to try and present our work. It led me to a book called Shaken Back, which was my first point of thinking about humor. And I'm going to ask you a joke or show you a joke now from my Bookworks commission, which was called, again, Shaken Back 2005, it was printed. A veiled woman was arrested on suspicion of terrorism. She claimed she was working undercover. So again, you might not be laughing, all of you laughing, you audience members out there, But the idea was for me to look at jokes as a way to unpick assumptions, stereotypes, the political situation of the time. And also on a personal level, it was that grappling of where do I want to be positioned? And actually, I only have really one piece of work that I've ever used the veil. And I'm going to talk about this because this was the work which was the reason I was invited to be part of this panel, which is very interesting because this was made in 2007. And again, one of the things that I loved about the Veil exhibition, again, was the breadth and depth of kinds of works. And for me, this was just a very simple, playful intervention that came out of a series of drawings that I did when I was in Saudi, where I thought all of these women looked like bowling balls when I would draw them in the way that I would draw them. And this is a piece of work called Skit, which is a simple intervention on a bowling ball, which is just putting a veil on the bowling ball. But for me, it was actually about how we can read into what this might mean. This is an object that people try to push over. It's a position of violence that's enacted upon this object. But actually, the object's actually incredibly beautiful when you see these little skittles that are somehow personified and take on this human element. I do them with a series of different scarves in a series of configurations. This is called Tipping Point, which is when there's a series of 10 of them. This is a series called Critical Mass, in which there are hundreds of them in a gallery space. And what's interesting for me is these have been exhibited in very different contexts. So in Mexico, they were exhibited under a show about textiles called Rebels and political movements. In France, in Spain, in Saudi Arabia, in Doha, in the Middle East. So the way in which the works take on very different meanings in different places. So I also have made this into a print. And what's really interesting for me is it was part of a show called Speech Acts in Manchester, and it was a print that was represented. And why I've showed this image is that one of the things that Hamad Nasser wrote is that he wanted to put an exhibition of work that moved beyond biography and beyond geography. And I think that's one of the things that I'm always trying to figure out, the idea of how we move beyond geography, sorry about that, beyond geography and beyond biography, and for the work to be read as work. So just a couple of weeks ago, I listened to an incredible podcast that Gaylene was on called Exploding the Canon, in which Labena Hamid was saying that she still wants her work to be talked about as work. And I think it's interesting because as artists, we still want our work to be spoken about as conceptual contemporary work for the colors, for the scale, for the texture, whatever it might be, but we're constantly being referred to by our religious or ethnic or cultural identity. And of course, some works, like for example, this, that sit very specifically in both a lived experience, a personal religious experience. I can understand why I would want this work to be read within that framework, but it's also about moving beyond that. And that my body of work is generally about agitating and creating questions outside of that. So for me, one of the successes of this exhibition was, again, highlighting something we talked about structural negligence that was mentioned before, about this idea that we can, this is a piece of work, the Speech Acts is an exhibition of work that's been collected by people of colour and BAME artists that have been sitting in warehouses and storerooms of galleries and never shown. Because if we don't have a context to show this work, for example, this veil work, then it's just sitting. But why can't it be shown as part of a photography exhibition? It needs a frame to fit within. It needs to be a show about women, Muslim, dual identity context. But actually what we want is for the work oftentimes to be read as work. So for me, I'm interested in the fact that it sits within a book, the Manchester Art Collection book, and it sits again alongside a Rodin. And I think I love this idea of the work just being presented, at least in this book, outside of those contexts, outside of those references of identity, geography, or biography, and is sitting alongside a well-known historical artwork. I'm just going to finish by saying one of the things that I mentioned before is I love to ask questions. I think the most important thing artists can do when they make work is provoke dialogue, debate, and ask questions. So I've been doing a series of questions since 2005. I've been asking the public, using humor and playfulness, questions about cultural assumptions around identity and assumptions around religion, and historical and personal perspectives of how we see the world. My questions are trying to unpin our own cultural assumptions. I'm just going to show you an illustration of how one of my questions are presented when they're presented within a gallery or a gallery context. So a question here that's quite relevant. Harvard University claimed that the Democratic Congresswoman Elizabeth Warren, who was reportedly 132 Native American, was one of their Native American tenured professors and a minority. So I beg the question of what is 132 as a decimal? But obviously the larger question is the way in which institutions need and use identity and identity politics for further gain. I'm going to end today just by asking actually everybody a question. So this is a question for Maria, for Gaylene, not necessarily to answer now, but also for the panelists and you viewing to just think about. I'm just asking you to think about this. How much do you think the work of culturally diverse artists is shaped and predicted on their cultural background? Do you think it's very much? Do you think it's just a little bit? Do you think not at all? Do you think, well, it depends on the individual? Or do you think you have no real idea, but you are quite liberal because you are actually currently listening to this Decolonising British Art seminar. So you're just generally going to agree with the consensus of the speakers. So I just want to end by asking you to ponder and think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. Thank you, Maria. Two really, yeah, thank you for ending with a question. I thought there were so many questions in both of your presentations. I think I want to give just 1 minute for the audience to either think, respond to Yara's question, which I'd love to hear those responses. I'm sure Yara will, but also if there's any other questions that you've got for Yara or Maria. So I'm going to give you just a minute and then we'll come back. Right. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions that have come through from the audience, but I'm going to go to Yara's question, provocation. And let's start there. So the question, remind us of the question, Yara.
Oh gosh, well, I need to get the exact wording right, but it is basically the question is, how much do you think the work of culturally diverse artists is predicted and shaped on their cultural background? And if we were to discuss that, what would both of you say?
Oh, well, I'll hand that over to you, Maria.
I think the first, probably the first, yeah. No.
Oh, I can't remember now what number one was. I'm sorry. No. And I've asked that question. I must apologize.
Let's have a look. I think it's the first.
A lot.
Yeah,
oh, a lot.
I think so.
A lot.
A lot.
Not so much.
I think that's what we both were talking about identity politics in a way. And I think how much we kind of wanted to kind of bring that into the surface. So yes, my answer is definitely number one.
Okay, which is interesting, because mine is it depends on the individual, and this is my point that I think I've been battling with for the past 15 years, and I graduated in 2005. That idea that it does depend on the individual, because in all honesty, and I'm going to be very honest, because I think this is what these panels are about, there's been far too many times I've been invited to do something based on my religion, the colour of my skin, the fact that I'm a female, half Middle Eastern artist, and I don't want to be selected on the basis of that. Of course, if the work fits and the context is right, but not all of my work, well, the majority of my work sits outside of notions around the veil. It sits within much larger geopolitical questions, and actually my work questions the role of art, the function of art, the way in which art can function for society and be a service provider. And it's about provoking lots of things. But I still seem to have been asked, for example, in my early years, to show during Black History Month. October was my busiest month. So there's actually, I would say it depends on the individual. Some artists are rooted in identity, and some look at it and look at other things.
Maria,
I think when I was saying I gave you the first answer, was the fact that the platforms exist only for works that you can categorize into veil. So I was talking from the perspective of people who give you the platform rather than the artists. Right. So as an artist, I'm fighting exactly the same kind of assumptions, presumptions, categorization. And I think the thing is, I think when the Veil exhibition or Shirin Nishat's exhibition came about, we hardly had anything. It was right at the start of the whole dialogue. I think it's only in retrospect, 20 years on, we can now think about, okay, now we can discuss these works outside of those kinds of frameworks. Although I would have to say, if we think about what Rashid Arim was saying in the year 2002, he was already complaining about everyone, including artists who kind of create these kind of self-orientalizing images that goes out there. And therefore, he sees it as a problem. I see it as a problem. But I'm just wondering how we can negotiate those kinds of arenas, like the Veil or anything which is to do with identity. I think is where we place ourselves in terms of identity politics. When does it become negative, reductive, and when does it actually become empowering? And how can it become empowering?
Well, Yara, the good thing is we've got quite a few answers from the audience. Do you want to get? Have you seen it? So
I can't go on.
So 16 out of 20 said depends. 3 out of 20 said very much. 1 out of 20 said quite liberal, thank you very much. And no one said a little.
I do love actually that somebody did just say that they're going to agree with the consensus of the speakers right here during these seminars. I think that's fabulous.
I mean, I think so. Here's the kind of tension, isn't it? And you're both speaking about this. I think one of the things it's shocking to hear Gaylene and Janan talk about it. It's shocking to hear you speak about it, Maria, which is what happened after 9/11, for example. Yeah. Which is you saying in the video, essentially people stopped returning your call. You couldn't get booked. So the street performance outside Dulwich Art Gallery was an act of kind of performative resistance or something. So I suppose the question comes, which is how do you then navigate the idea that actually your ideas are expansive, yet in terms of how you're dealt with in a kind of institutional capacity often isn't.
Sure.
Any things that have worked for you with regards to that?
Well, I think the reason I've actually showed that video is to really show the condition of many artists. So it's not just me. I found, the way I've negotiated it has been through curatorial work, and not only that, but also kind of continuing to make my own work, trying to avoid being shown in this kind of category of Iranian artists or Muslim artists. So I have resisted it in different kinds of ways. So there's been different strategies of dealing with it. But I think what I wanted to do was to highlight these issues in my video. It's not for me, it's not simply enough for us to just throw images out there which can linger somewhere and it can be read either as Orientalist or with a particular idea of identity. But how can we bring our own histories into our own work? So I begin to bring the everyday or my memoir or my kind of what's happening in my context into my work, and that's part of my my strategy really. Also, kind of another strategy is I'm doing a PhD. That in itself is a way of actually is a strategy of actually getting my concerns in an academic arena where other people can have access to it and read it, perhaps a younger generation. So there are different strategies that artists can use apart from their own work.
Yara, you I love this idea, your joke book response, for example, right, to your commission and ways in which you use play to invert or subvert some of the requests that come through. But there's something that I want to I just thought was a really lovely parallel right back to the first seminar that happened, seems like 6 months ago, but it was literally in last week, between the BAM project, Sonia Boyce is leading, and Mima, and BAM working with Mima to look at object-centered appraisals of work, right? So beyond exactly the way that you framed it, lovely, beyond geography, beyond biography. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that, seeing as it's a really nice bookend to where we started last week, about what would that look like for you?
Oh, specifically about looking at objects and reframing
Yeah, in
them?
terms of your own work, you said you want your work, your interest.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm exactly sure how to answer, but I think for me, what's really interesting is that idea is how we could subvert something. I utilize now all these opportunities. I don't stand away from them, but I say, okay, let me get within that and then critique the institution that I'm in. Let me unpick that and critique it. I mean, a simple sort of relevant context to talk about is just two things very briefly. Yeah. So after the joke book, after I said, okay, I'll do it, but I'm going to write a book of jokes. I started hosting pub quizzes, and I've done pub quizzes at Tate Britain and all of these institutions. But every time I'm in the National Portrait Gallery, the National Maritime Museum, or Tate, I go in there and unwittingly to the curators, obviously, without wanting to offend them, I'm in there to agitate. And I ask about works that are in that show. I've done research and say, well, actually, what does it mean that, you know, the exhibition at African seeing Africa is just sexualized objects? Does it mean this is or this? So I'll go there, ask a series of questions, and actually use it as a place to critique how they are presenting art, how they're doing that. Mm-hmm. Or for a recent project with DAX in 2017, which was called The Contract, and was about the social contract. I used a newspaper project to actually create an advice column that actually unpicks this notion of the social contract, the relationship between the artist, the institution, the gallery, and looking within that about identity politics, and actually being an artist, quote unquote, that writes in for advice about having to use and capitalize on their identity to get work, but feeling guilty because they don't really feel they belong to that identity, but using it because it can get them in a show, and being very open with this sort of advice column to try and unpick it. So I think for me, it's about getting inside the institution to critique it with humor, playfulness, and joy. I think for me, I want to make work that's not didactic, but is actually about agitating. And I feel I get that sense of agitation was in the Veil exhibition, the ways in different ways, different artists use different ways to create conversation and debate.
Yes, nice. Unfortunately, we're going to have to pause there because we're out of time, but I just want to thank both of you for bringing some of that joy and that energy, and you know, expanding that particular kind of concepts or views that none of us necessarily here have, but actually it's very easy to fall into if you're not careful. So I've been very inspired, I'm sure lots of people have been, by the way in which you're presenting your own ideas and work. So thank you very much, everybody. We're going to go for another 5-minute break. So we'll be back just after 10 to. Welcome back to the third and final part of the seminar series and the closing section in total. So we've got in conversation Susan Puissant-Locke, who has been really our gatherer really over the seminar series, and Sepake Angiyama in conversation. So Sepake took up the role of Artistic Director of Iniva at the beginning of this year. She most recently served as curator of this year's Chicago Architecture Biennale, and has previously held positions at Hayward Gallery, Turner Contemporary, the International Foundation Manifesta, and Documenta 14. Susan Puissant-Locke is an artist and writer based in London who has exhibited and published widely since the 1990s. She was appointed Director of the UAL Decolonising British Institute in October 2019. Prior to joining UAL, she was co-investigator on the AHRC-funded project Black Artists in Modernism, led by UAL in partnership with Middlesex University. So I'm going to hand over to both of you to continue and conclude our conversation really on decentering, resituating, reviewing in relationship to institutions.
Thank you so much, Gaylene. Sapaka, you're muted. I have at least one moment of accidental muting, unmuting.
Okay, hi, Susan, you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we can
good.
hear you
okay, great.
loud and clear. So maybe just to frame this section a little bit, Sapaka and I were talking about what we would like to do with this time. And I think we want to reflect a little on the rich conversations today. I mean, there's so much to be said, but we also wanted to extend our conversation outwards to think about the value and importance of Vale historically, and the work we're both doing in our distinct but also very distinctly related intersecting institutes around research and archives and the difficulties of some of this work. Sapaka, did you want to start?
Yeah, just firstly, thank you, Susan, for the invitation. Thank you for putting this series, the seminars, together. And yeah, thank you to all of those who've spoken. It's been, for me, it's actually been an opportunity to discover elements around the Vale exhibition that I could not necessarily gather simply from the archive or from, I have also the publication, here with me. And what's been really interesting is to also, I guess, witness how the exhibition and the publication, as well as our archive, are in demand. Actually, that was something that Janan sort of mentioned. Is it of interest? And it absolutely is. And it's actually probably one of the first projects that we're going to try and look at how we can fully make that accessible and available digitally, because of the fact that it is in so much demand. And so in some ways it also, I think, being obviously the artistic director of Iniva now is obviously very different from when Gaylene and even maybe Melanie have been working at Iniva, just in terms of, I think, the weight of some of the responsibility of being actually the archive and the holder of this information, and a place where researchers, curators and artists come in order to kind of understand the continuity of their own practice. I think I'd said to you, Susan, how important the African and Asian Visual Artist Archive was for me in my formation and understanding of previous practices. I hadn't had the opportunity in my education for anyone to talk to me about the Black Arts movement, or to talk to me about, I sort of really resonated actually very much when Yara was talking about, there were these two books that she would go to and look back and front in terms of trying to understand where can she situate her own practice. So I just sort of, I think I just wanted to just reflect on that a little bit, just in terms of the responsibility not only of art history, the archive and the institution, what roles I think we play going forward, not only in the contextualization of objects and items in collections and museums, but also in making a space to maybe recontextualize, reframe, readdress some of the issues that have been raised in previous exhibitions and artworks alike.
Yes, I a lot of what you've said there, Sapaka, resonates for me too. Arva, I have connections with, and we discovered this quite happily through one of our conversations. I did my PhD located with Arva, whose existence I wasn't aware of until I saw an opportunity for doctoral funded work through, not online, we didn't have that then, there's a tiny advert in the Times Higher Educational Supplement. And the actual, I mean, to go and see the archive was to travel out to Plaistow and then start sort of leafing through files with loose slides and You know, one of the things that I'm always surprised at kind of over and over is no matter how many times I work with different archives of different scales, is the opacity of you know, much archival material. And I think that making this kind of space, the spaces across these seminars to revisit moments, projects, curatorial, museological, exhibitionary, histories. You know, we can't do that work just in archives or libraries. It's hard enough to access the materials if you're lucky enough, you know, to find that library or archive holds them. But it's, you know, it's acknowledging everything that can't be captured, isn't captured materially, tangibly in those spaces, because they are held in individuals. They're embodied in people's experiences and memories. And these conversations remind us of that, and remind us of the work that we still need to do, to the ongoing, I mean, there's not a kind of end point here, the kind of ongoing work of revisiting, resituating, recontextualizing both the work, individual works by artists, artists' practices more widely, curatorial practices, and I think always to think about, always to remember to consider both the context of their making and realization, and the context, the specific context and moments of us revisiting them. So there's never a more neutral or objective moment from which we can look back and say, oh yes, I get that now. We might read a work, an intervention differently, but we don't get it more or less. So I guess that sort of brings me back to the those terms, time and care, that kind of keep coming up, and the different time frames, which, you know, Gaylene also touched on, picking up on the things that Gaylene and Janan were talking about in relation to process. This work, the work of research, the work of you know, curation, the work of, you know, an artist's practice they all take time, and coming back to spending time with the work once it's made, spending time with work when it's exhibited, spending time with its documentation, and spending time thinking about where we are looking again from, how we are looking. I think that's all recurring in a kind of, it's cyclical, it loops, as Gaylene was saying earlier. You know, there isn't a kind of a certain distance in which there's suddenly greater clarity. We often kind of loop back on ourselves, and I think lots of our conversations, okay, have looped back on themselves, but I like to think in a generative rather than necessarily simply repetitive way.
I mean, I think one of the things that I also really appreciate what you're sort of talking about in terms of time and care, but also Janan's conversations, artist to artist, and how that kind of was then maybe supported through different forms of infrastructure, whether that was having a bit of funding or an institution saying, okay, we can give the infrastructural support in order to enable this to happen. But I also really appreciated what Gaylene kind of discussed in terms of Iniva as a kind of agency that has to work in partnership by not having a space that enables an opportunity for this conversation to be expanded and to reach various different publics. I also think it's really interesting that it wasn't, in the kind of art metropoles. It wasn't in, London, but it was actually in, I think it was in Liverpool, in Walsall, and what was the third one? In
Oxford.
In Oxford. And I think it's really important that, and that's something I'm definitely discovering through a lot of the work that we're doing currently with Future Collect, and that really rides off the back of the research that you were also involved in with Black artists and modernism, project in terms of looking at regional collections and how that tells a narrative or doesn't tell a narrative of contemporary society, and how do we readdress this balance. I also was really struck by, in some of your questioning, you were sort of talking about centering and decentering in terms of museums, and how does a museum, you know, decenter itself almost. Or I often think about, how does a museum or gallery, especially in the context of today, decenter whiteness, you know, that perspective on these topics. I noticed that Brian Biggs, for example, in his comments said that, you know, Vail coming to Blue Coat paved the way for us to present more artists from and work relating to the Arab world, including several shows curated by Liverpool Arab Arts Festival. So just recognising also Vail as an exhibition that maybe opened up an opportunity to bring maybe new works in, maybe to further or open up an opportunity for research. And I think, as Gaylene said, you know, open up a whole new audience and public who are interested and invested in cultural spaces and what they, or how they maybe represent culture more broadly.
I think it's, yeah, thank you for referring to Brian's question there, and to Blue Coat, which I think is one of those less well-known, perhaps, absolute gems of an institution who's done, you know, incredible work over, I'm not going to say 300 years, because it makes it sound like Brian's 300 years old, and we know that he's not. But, you know, there have been incredible exhibitions that arguably have been more radical in their curatorial approach, because they haven't been hampered by or constrained by the larger, what should I say, the weight of certain institutions, trophies of empire for one. You know, there have been many coming out of Blue Coat, and also that Blue Coat has worked on collaboratively with other institutions that, you know, including in the case of Vail. I wanted to pick up on the Speech Acts exhibition, and to underline the fact that exhibition and the curatorial approach was very much shaped by the research of the Black Artisan Modernism Project, and the importance of that project team being quite interdisciplinary. Basically, you know, it wasn't an art historical project. There were artists, curators on that team, and our various ways of thinking and seeing, you know, impacted, you know, hugely on obviously shaped the way we worked and approached the arguably unanswerable questions that we posed. And I think I just want to make a connection there to the fact that Iniva was working, as you say, as an agency, or compelled to, and put itself in a situation where it was compelled to work productively, generatively, collaboratively with other organizations. And I think, you know, successful collaborations take a huge amount of relationship building and trust to be successful. But also within that, there was a really important collaboration between curators and artists. And, you know, my sense of how, you know, the artists, this was very much kind of artist-led or driven curatorial project. And those, that moment, the kind of reference to those T-shirts that I didn't know. I know you want one, Speke. I'd like one too, if they can be found anywhere in the Iniva archive. You know, I didn't know about those T-shirts, but it's kind of an extra, or rather part of the important contextual history around the exhibition, its reception, but that complicates, you know, that relationship. It's not just the artists, curators make this thing, it goes out there, there are all these responses. The artists then talk back, you know, they react. the response is a creative, critical, collective one. It's performative, it's playful. And I'm really interested in how sort of the performativity of Yara's and Maria's work kind of picks up that spirit. Maria's performance, filmed performance that she shared, belly dancing in public, there's something really kind of rich and kind of complicating in the fact that this film is overlaid with a double voiceover, where her voice isn't clear or distinct. You know, it's troubled, so that your reading of Maria's voice is troubled, and it's troubled because the image is. It also troubles the image. It kind of overlays both. It situates the image, the performance in a socio-political context, in a narrative about how that impacts on her as an artist professional, as well as her embodied uncomfortable experience of performing in this space. And then I love how Yara puts us, the audience, in that space of discomfort. So, you know, I'm looking always for sort of connections and continuities, the loops as well as the ruptures, and the unexpected. You know, I was excited about the unexpected connections that would arise out of the curators and artists talking together today.
I mean, I was actually thinking very much about also how, and I suppose this is also comes up in Maria's work, but how the veil is this kind of, becomes this kind of permeable, although it's a concealing device, although it's something that maybe doesn't allow you to have a kind of complete understanding of what is seen and what is not being seen. And but I was thinking about that also, just I guess in relation to institutions, in terms of like I guess what Yara reveals within her practice, although using humor as a device, as a way of being able to ask questions, but those questions actually are questions that are able to kind of permeate or go beyond or a way of challenging sort of frameworks or frames of ways of thinking and ways of seeing. And I think that was the other aspect I felt was really interesting that came through to me, was how an exhibition might be able to challenge ways of seeing and ways of making work, which is what sort of Yara referred to. And then in that way, how an institution like Iniva or Decolonising might create space, like literally make space for these questions through research, and through creating space for research, because there, especially right now, I think there is a, you know, I think institutions are troubled. Institutions are troubled because if it's not possible today for cultural institutions to make a statement around anti-racism without a backlash from artists, then, you know, then we're in trouble right now. And I think it's really important to take stock of this moment, not as simply how do we fix it, you know, what's the solution, but actually for an opportunity for institutions to reflect on themselves and their practices. And that's something that, you know, I've recognized also at Iniva, it's really important for us to do, to sort of say, okay, we need a moment to kind of take stock of our work. Because I think similarly to what Yara mentioned, I think Iniva can often be instrumentalized as an institution that is working with artists from, you know, culturally diverse backgrounds. And so if we work with Iniva, we're doing the work of anti-racism and inclusion. But actually, I think similarly for how maybe artists have to really think about who they partner with and where they show their work. I think actually that's kind of Maria was reflecting on, you know, how do you kind of build in the kind of act of resistance in your work so that wherever it's shown, that its intention is clear, is something that that kind of refusal actually is also a saying yes to something else. And I guess that's that a lot of the questions that arise through the exhibition, such as Veil, but through the work of Iniva, through really, you know, I guess, yeah, through these various kind of statements and actions, I'm increasingly aware of the importance of the Stuart Hall Library, for example, to recognise that this is not necessarily a unique moment, but there's a continuity of progression and practice that we are all invested in. And sometimes, you know, the act of censoring, the act of saying that image can't be shown, you know, if you look at I noticed that in the publication that the images of AES Art Group are kind of quite prominent in the first couple of pages. And, you know, maybe today we won't necessarily have the same kind of visual response that we had when they were sort of initially kind of thought about in the Walsall exhibition and in the close proximity to the events of 9/11. But I think that this notion of thinking through the visual, and that may be a way of allowing us to think beyond questions of simply identity and cultural politics. I think it's really important for us to, I think, also use that mechanism of looking, of seeing, and also ways of coming together, because I see very much art practice and, you know, institutional practice as a way of coming together to, as you say, you know, think about multiple perspectives and multiple viewpoints. And I feel as if the flexibility that we both have as institutions is the possibility of operating in multiple spaces, and almost like mediating or holding space for certain kinds of practices to emerge.
I like what you say a lot, Sabay, and I very much agree with the idea that part of our roles, part of what we do, or what we should be doing, is to be trying to open up and hold those spaces for things to emerge, to allow things that to allow ourselves to not know what might emerge through those processes, conversations. And what you were saying just before that about, you know, seeing again, looking differently, reviewing, I think we need to be doing that continuously. And I'm suddenly thinking of the title of one of Keith Piper's works from the 90s, Relocating the Remains. It's a kind of perpetual necessity to relocate, to resituate, because as you were saying, you know, how we look at a work, or how you or I might have looked at a certain piece of work at a particular point in time, thought about it, how we might look at it today, tomorrow. So it's, you know, it's contingent to so many factors, and we need to be prepared to go back, to look again, to constantly look again, and to think again. And I think that's we're recognizing. I think we were kind of sharing gut feelings, also with, you know, through conversations with Melanie, well over a year back, about this, you know, about Veil, and also with Janan, you know, in recent, I want to say months, but it's probably years. You know, it keeps coming back, it's circling, and I like the idea that the work also circles. It's not, you know, we actively circle works and images and texts, and they circle back at us too. It's this question of what and who has agency. And I just also wanted to pick up on the point, you know, that both Yara and Maria raised around agency, around how artists are wary of being instrumentalized, and, you know, I think we have both experienced versions of that as artists, curators too. I think we're also, wary of the institutes that we are in the process of revisioning. We're wary of being instrumentalized institutionally too. And we've said to each other, and it's worth reminding ourselves over and over that, and others, that being in the room, the institutes being in the room is not the work itself. Being invited into a space does not mean that work's been done. It's a start of something, and we individually, the institutes, cannot do the work that museums, collections, arts institutions need to be doing right now, should have started doing already, need to continue doing into the indefinite future.
I mean, I think that's something I've definitely understood through the work of Future Collect, which is so Future Collect as a project is fundamentally asking the question, whether our collections can and do, represent our contemporary society, and then in what way can there be a model to think about how new acquisitions can be developed through the commissioning of a contemporary artist. And that project is also supported, I think, also by the opportunity for curators inside the museum to come to the Stuart Hall Library to spend some time to do research, but also a curatorial trainee. So at the moment, Nikita Gill is working with Jade Montserrat in Manchester Art Gallery. And one of the things that has come to light through that project has been the importance of, as we say, institutions doing the work, but that the work does not necessarily primarily need to be done by the person of colour in that institution. Because I think that this is the kind of issue that we're seeing, is that there is an absolute need for our museums in terms of its programming staff to be much more reflective of contemporary society. And at the moment, I would say that we are also undergoing, lots of cuts within the arts. There's lots of redundancies and things are happening. And actually, we have to be really careful that we're not also undoing some of the work around cultural diversity. And the reason why I sort of, point to this also, I guess, also in relation to this exhibition with Vale in particular, and is, I remember, and I don't know if I heard Gaylene say this directly, but that there was this sense that Iniva, should almost work itself out of a job, that almost that the institution should no longer need to exist, because the kind of broader understanding, education and knowledge around, diversifying practices, curatorial and otherwise, would not need this kind of institution sort of knocking on the door and saying, hey, have you looked at this? Are you looking at that? And of course, I think this is something that, that kind of actually, Gaylene also mentioned today, this kind of looping. What I recognize very much is that how much knowledge is embodied. So sometimes when certain figures, curators, directors, otherwise move on, that the institution somehow does not necessarily retain the kind of ethos and drive that those individuals were able to manifest within their institutions. And you can see that in collections, actually. That's what's very interesting, is where you have certain key figures moving within museums and galleries. That's reflect that, their kind of way of thinking about collecting is reflected in their collection. And when they move on, then they're no longer, you can no longer sort of see that drive in the institutions. And so I think, I'm still sort of thinking, how do we move beyond the need. I guess it's still the same thing that Gaylene was, concerned with. How does Iniva move beyond the need for it to exist? Because actually, I would like to see that it's not just about saying, we've come up with this idea to have an exhibition like such as Veil, but that actually the sector itself, the kind of infrastructure that supports exhibitions such as Veil, is the thing that needs to be radically transformed and shifted. It's not only just putting on the exhibition, it's recognizing that the very structures that we work within need to be completely rethought. And I guess for me, decolonising is part of that process. There are other processes that we need to undergo as well, but decolonising is definitely one of them.
Thank you, Sapake. And I'm really conscious of time all of a sudden. I should have been more conscious. And I'm wondering whether Gaylene will come back and see whether there may be any questions from the audience for either of us. While we wait for Gaylene to return and possible questions to appear, I want to pick up on what you just said, Sapake, and to go back to what you were saying earlier about decentering whiteness. Decolonising has to start, cannot happen without challenging white supremacy, has to start with decentering whiteness. And I think there's a, just to kind of also refer to a conversation that Gaylene and I had the other day, we were talking about the need to be prepared to step aside, to share power or drop the mic, whatever the, we've been talking about different moments, contexts in which we might do all those things. But it also, reminds me of this problematic idea of inviting other voices in, bringing other voices in. What happens when they leave? What are the terms of invitation, and what happens when we leave? I'm going to stop there and let Gaylene maybe have some last words.
Yeah, well, thank you both, actually. It was really nice just to hear a kind of reflections in this way, and I think it's really nice to end on Iniva, I think going back to where we started with Ban and Mima and these interventionist projects and moments, to an organisation that has a long history of trying really different fluid ways of creating platforms for a range of artists who don't normally have that kind of space. And I really liked what Sapake said about embodiment, which I think, like Susan was saying, is something that I think a lot about, which is actually, knowledge, passion, love, care, triggers, all of these things are part of very unique biographies. And until we have a much more, dare I say it, but diverse mix of biographies, mix of perspectives in all kinds of spaces across culture and across institutions, it's always going to be a question of intervention. Do you know what I mean? It's always a question of how do you then interrupt this, rather than actually how are those ideas constantly circulating everywhere. The only thing I would graciously challenge is I really hope Iniva always exists. Actually, I think there's a need for spaces like Iniva, like the 198 Gallery, like spaces that are actually there all the time, that are able to do deep work, a bit like what Janan was talking about, are able to really have a space to do long-term, deep, reflective work within kind of these boutique spaces almost. So long may it exist,
Yeah, I'm sorry if that sounded like a off the cuff remark. I guess I was really just struck by the fact that Iniva, in a way, I believe exists because of an inability for other museums and galleries to take up that work. And so, and I think while Iniva exists, there still feels as if there is that onus on us as an institution to take up the work. So if anything, I think we're hopefully also a catalyst, a way of kind of modeling practice, a way of also, I guess in some ways, for many people, they sort of talk about how the Stuart Hall Library was finally a place to say they felt at home, because they could see the genealogy of practices where they could situate their own practice and could find their own voice. And that, and so I really see the kind of benefit of having such a unique collection altogether. And I am still shocked, I have to say, still surprised by institutions, cultural institutions, still looking to the question of, we need to reach out. But actually the thing is that many people are very much interested in working in cultural institutions, but the retention is an issue. How we kind of deal with questions of cultural diversity is still an issue. And I would probably point to pedagogy. I'd probably point to our education system as also a space that really needs to be transformed and to be thought through, because I feel as if, I came to the African and Asian Visual Artists Archive when I was probably in my 20s. I was 23 or 24 and had no idea about a Black arts movement. So, and even practices that come before that. But I just feel as if the interruption that we discussed needs to probably happen much earlier and in other systems of other institutional systems.
I think we're drawn to a close, but I think I just want to thank Susan and the Decolonising Arts Institute in a way for bringing together some fantastic case studies. I think that's what's been really fascinating, isn't it, about these seminars, is that they've allowed to deep dive into specific moments. And also, quite frankly, it's kind of made me feel quite hopeful. Well, not hopeful. It's a reminder of the great practice that is out there. Do you know what I mean? I think all of these, even there's tensions in all of them, the attention to the commitment to the attempt, the commitment to that, like you were saying, that long, slow, that tenuous journey has been really heartening. So yeah, thank you, Susan, and for the team for creating the space, for sure.
Well, thank you, Gaylene, for moderating so fluently, elegantly and articulately throughout the 4 seminars, riding the odd technical glitch without the that of an eye. We are drawing to a close. We're into the last minute, so I want to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers today, Gaylene, Janan, Maria, Yaris, Paquet, and to the audience. To Gaylene again, and to all our colleagues behind the scenes who've really made this possible, Clare Pattenden, the Institute Manager, and Tom and Georgina from the Creative Computing Institute, and of course to the British Art Network for making this seminar series possible. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, Gaylene.